Okay, good morning, AP Lit. This is a little reminder of literary elements versus literary techniques. Two words that are thrown around with rather careless abandon. There is a difference between the two. So to begin, you've got two terms here, elements and techniques. The difference is this: elements are unavoidable in lit. Unavoidable. You cannot have literature without these elements. If these elements are not present, you don't have literature. They're unavoidable. Literary techniques vary piece to piece. So literary techniques are the things that writers do to create those elements. Techniques create or craft or show. There's your weak verb. They create, craft, or show elements. Hopefully that's clear as mud. All right. So anyway, this little gadget here, Ms. Diggins found. She found it from a reputable source, the AP Literature Facebook page. You know, take that for what it's worth. But a lot of this is stuff that we've talked about in class. And as always, I'm going to make this. I'm going to email. This document is available on Canvas, and I can also email it to you if you can't access it through Canvas. So anyway, this should sound really familiar to you. You should be able to explain how and why the author uses them. So the why, and I want to beat this into your head, the why is about association. What do we associate with that choice? How is how it was employed. So was the literary element employed to create setting? Was the literary element employed to create character? Was it employed to create conflict, plot, etc.? All right, so we're going to go through this list, and we're going to identify which ones are elements and which ones are techniques. All right, so characterization. You can't have a story without characters. That is an element. All right, the creation and development of characters. So you're going to find that description by the narrator, dialogue, thoughts, actions, physical description, social interaction, psychological state. So basically, the writer's going to tell us things, and this comes down to your details and your imagery, but we'll get to that later. And then setting, that is an element. All right. So where a writer decides to set a work matters. What's going on in the environment matters. Time and place matter. For example, you guys remember Pride and Prejudice. That interaction between Elizabeth Bennet and her nemesis. Oh, geez, lady. What was her name again? It's an old lady played by Dame Judi Dench. The name escapes me right now. Yeah, it escapes me. Anyway, they had that interaction. That interaction took place in a garden. It took place in a private setting. Setting matters. That's the thing too. God, lady, it's gonna bug me now. It's gonna bug. I've got to look it up. It's gonna bother me. Why I can't remember that. All right. Let's see. Well, it's not Lady Chatterley. That's something else. Mr. Collins kept going on about her. There we go. Lady Catherine. My God. It's because I'm making these videos way too early. All right, so Lady Catherine and Elizabeth Bennet, where they had their final interaction, mattered. So time and place matter. When does Macbeth choose to carry out their murders? At night. Spoiler alert, Macbeth kills Duncan. You guys have had months to catch up on that. All right, that's descriptions of locations, dates, time of year, etc. Where a writer chooses to set a piece matters. Plot. You can't have a story without plot. That is an element. Unavoidable. Unavoidable. How a writer chooses to tell us a story matters. Plot, the sequence of events in, say, A Rose for Emily, affect how we view the story. It starts with her funeral, and then it kind of works backwards. It works backwards and then sideways, and it moves around a little bit, but that plot order, when we're told about certain events, matters. So you've got all these fun words: initial incident, rising action, turning point, climax, falling action, denouement. That's a nice fancy word for resolution. And then this is your good old-fashioned plot structure pyramid. It looks something like this, right? You know, climax, and then resolution. And that's your falling action, and that's your rising action. And the thing I would tell you about plot is this is how it works. A character discovers they want something. What seeks to go get it? What results from that? That's plot. All right, theme. Theme, my God, theme. Theme is an element. You can't have a story without theme. Every story has a theme. All right, central idea of a literary work, and the way you would, and this has to be beat into your little heads. The way one defines that is, you guys don't need to know about eye motors. You don't need to know that. Dismiss. Why that keeps happening, I don't know. I don't know. All right, so anyway, theme. Author's view of humanity. And really, to simplify that, it really is going to fall into three categories. The author thinks we all are terrible people. The author has a hopeful view of humanity, or perhaps the author has a mixed view. While we may do terrible things, the author is relatively hopeful. While the author is relatively hopeful, we still do terrible things with tragic consequences. You see how you can create a generic theme with those three combinations. So here it is: widely held human concerns such as love, death, blah, blah, blah. But really, essentially, what is the human condition? We are born, we live, we die. We are born, we live, we die. So writers usually concern themselves either with being born, living, or dying. So is this a story about living? Is it a story about dying? Is it a story about being born and coming into the world, coming of age? Or is it a story of fading glory? And then I would refer you back up to here. I'd refer you back up to there. What's going on in the arc of the character? The theme is usually revealed by the characters. And because writers want us to get it, they really do. They're not trying to hide anything from us. One of the characters at one point usually says the theme. They make a statement and you go, oh, well, Sure, there it is. There's that character that's there to hit you over the head and give you the theme. All right, conflict. All right, conflict. You can't have a story without conflict. That is an element. All right, so struggle between characters, obstacles that a character must overcome. So here's your conflicts. Do not confuse conflicts with plot. You've heard there are 7 plots. No, there's hundreds of plots, thousands of plots, millions of plots, but there are only these conflicts. All right, point of view. Now, point of view, in every story, there's a point of view. Therefore, it is an element. And what are your point of views? Sometimes stories are told from multiple points of view. Margaret Atwood employs this technique quite a lot. Sometimes, for example, in the novel Year of the Flood. I can't recommend it enough. It's very timely. One of the characters, so it's told from 2 different points of view. One point of view is told in first person. The other point of view is told in third person. So this has been beat into your head a million times. You've got first person, second person, and then third person. And with third person, there's limited third person, and then there's omniscient, third person omniscient. So then that's when the narrator knows everything. So third person limited point of view, basically, when that character is not present, there's no action. Pride and Prejudice is third person limited point of view. Nothing happens without Elizabeth around. That's essentially how you define it. Most of your pot boilers, your commercial literature, that's kind of how you can tell the difference. Most of your commercial literature is omniscient third person point of view. So if you're reading like Jurassic Park, or you're reading a Stephen King novel, although Stephen King likes to jump around between omniscient and third person, that's how you set up suspense. Oh, don't go behind there, don't go behind there, because we the reader know more than the characters on stage here, and that's how dramatic irony is created through omniscient third person point of view. So if you're dealing with a prompt, how does the writer create suspense? They create suspense through the employment of omniscient third person point of view, which creates the dramatic irony where the audience knows more than the people in the piece. That's what creates suspense. See, we just figured it out. Second person. All right, writers use second person, but you need to not do it. For the love of all that's right and holy in the world, don't use second person in your writing. Don't use second person to write about literature. It's just icky. Don't do it. I can almost always tell a lower half response when a kid uses second person. All right. All right. Tone. Tone is an element. And it varies. Tone is created through diction. Now we're starting to get into techniques. So tone is an element and a technique. So it's both. Diction is a technique. Now, some of you might say, gee, Mr. Dycus, diction means words. How are words unavoidable? Very easy. There's a graphic novel called The Arrival, which is about immigrants, and it is devoid of words. There are no words in The Arrival. It is all a graphic novel. So therefore, words are avoidable in stories. Words are avoidable. There are many silent films. No words. Diction is a technique. Mood. Mood varies. It is also a technique. Big mood. Is that still a thing? Probably is. It's a technique and an element. So these are both. Running out of room. But these are both. Mood is the audience. Mood belongs to the audience. Tone belongs to the people in the story. Narrator can have a tone. And that is found. Tone, if you start talking about diction, you have to mention tone. So if you're analyzing a piece and you start talking about the diction in the story and you don't talk about the tone, you're only doing half the job. You're saying to your parents, yes, I mowed the lawn. You've mowed the front, but you've ignored the back, and then you're off screwing around with your friends. Don't do that. All right, structure. Structure is both a technique and an element. All right, so don't confuse it with plot. Structure, it can be chronological. It can be a frame story in which the story in some way begins or ends where it started. One of the most famous examples I can think of this is the movie Milk with Sean Penn. It's a biopic about the politician Harvey Milk, where it starts with the guy is making tapes, and he's sitting there talking into a tape recorder, and it ends with him making tapes. Another example is The Diary of Anne Frank. It starts with her writing in her novel or in her diary. It ends with an excerpt from her diary. Handmaid's Tale is also a frame story where it's structured around her diary entries. So the big thing about structure, if you're going to write about structure, is that really just pay attention to chronological order and frame stories. There's tons of stuff we can get into with structure, but all right. If you've got 45 minutes to analyze a piece and you're looking at the structure, all right, is this chronological? Boom, 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 boom. Or is it a frame story? We got an element at the beginning and an element at the end. Is it kind of a full circle kind of thing? In a 45-minute time write, I wouldn't mess around with structure. That's just me. Your mileage may vary. All right, so allegory. Now we're getting heavy into technique. That is a technique. Okay, so Arthur Miller's The Crucible uses the Salem witch trials as an allegory for the hunt for communists in America in the 1950s. So it's the representation, it says there, representation of ideas or moral principles by means of symbolic characters, events, or objects. So a really big famous allegory that a lot of people are familiar with is although the X-Men movies aren't as famous as they once were, now I'm going to nerd out on you. In the late 90s, early 2000s, when one thought about Marvel, one thought about Spider-Man and the X-Men. Spider-Man and X-Men were the face of that franchise. Well, now it's all about Iron Man and the Avengers, and we all know why. But the X-Men are actually, and I've said this in class many times, I repeat myself just entirely too much, but that's so you remember things. That's why I repeat it. The X-Men, a comic book and a movie series, is an allegory for racial tension. Stan Lee is on record talking about how he wanted to tell a story, because it was written in the 1960s, about racial tension in America. And the way you pick up on allegories is if you're reading something and you say to yourself, hey, this sounds an awful lot like ... you're probably reading an allegory. All right, alliteration is a technique. Alliteration is also syntax, because syntax has to do with sentence structure. So, repetition of initial first consonant sounds. The falling flakes fluttered to the ground. The swift silent serpent slithered along. So you got the F, 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 S, S, S. And why do writers employ alliteration? Emphasis, flow. I'm sure there's a million other reasons, but really emphasis and flow. It makes a passage more memorable. The falling flakes fluttered to the ground. It's also imagery. Alliteration also can be used to really make that image stand out and let us see and hear and experience what's going on. Assonance and consonants. These are, pause the tape, element or technique. They're techniques. All right, repetition of vowel sounds. He made the trade of gold for jade. Oh, gold doesn't rhyme. All right, so here we'll just erase that one. All right, so A, those are your vowel sounds. A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y. And then consonants, the repetition of consonant sounds within words. So within the words, bells, tell, sell, muscles. It's that L sound within the words. So alliteration is repetition of first consonant sound. Consonance is the repetition within the words. These have more to do with poetry. And since this year it's going to be question 2, you probably don't need to deal with those two very often. Hyperbole. Oh, we all know hyperbole, right? Hyperbole. Hyperbole is exaggeration, right? This is people exaggerate. It was literally the worst day of my life. That's hyperbole. It probably wasn't. This is literally terrible. What's happening to me? It probably isn't. All right. So, in fact, use of the term "I literally was there." That itself is employment of the word "literally" in front of something is a form of hyperbole. It's also a figure of speech. It's figurative language, which is kind of ironic because the difference between literal and figurative, people are using literally now as a figure of speech. Ha 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 ha. All right. So yeah, we know this. We know this. We're not gonna. It's a technique. We're not going to get into it too much. We've hammered that. Imagery. So it appeals to the 5 senses. Imagery is all about experience. It's experiential. It's seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting. It's all about putting the reader there. It's all about experience. It's technique. So if you're talking imagery, you're talking about how does the writer get the reader to experience this world by appealing to the senses. So the tree roots clutched the ground like gnarled fingers, while the frightened screech of an unseen animal tore through the night. So you notice you also have personification in here, a tree root clutching. So sometimes you end up with a bonus coupon. It's personification and imagery. Gnarled, that's an image. We see it. All right, so we've talked about irony, verbal, situational, dramatic, saying the opposite of what is meant, sarcasm, situational, situation turns out opposite than what is expected, and dramatic. Now, when it comes to irony, a lot of people give Alanis Morissette a lot of grief that her song, "Isn't it ironic, don't you think?" Actually, some of those weren't irony, they were just coincidence. But I would push back and say that situational irony depends on the viewer. It depends on the experience of the viewer. It depends on your expectations. So if you expect a knife and you get 10,000 spoons, well, that's different than what you expected. That is, in fact, irony. We should all lay off Alanis Morissette. All right, so but this is a technique. All right, flashback. Flashback. Insertion of a scene or event that took place in the past, often appearing as a memory. So flashbacks, I can't say it any better. Why use a flashback? They want to reveal. Writers want to reveal something, so they use a flashback. It's a technique. Foreshadowing. Some of these are middle school classics. Foreshadowing is a middle school classic. It is also a technique. All right, it's a hint of events that come later in a literary work. Gray clouds at the beginning of a story may foreshadow a storm or conflict that occurs later. Well, of course it does. Well, of course it does. And then metaphors are techniques. The purpose of a metaphor, for the 90 millionth time, I'm only going to say it 90 million more times. The purpose of a metaphor is to make the unfamiliar familiar. That is why we use metaphors. We are trying to take something you don't know and make it part of your experience. Metaphors are analogies. So if you're saying what's the difference between an analogy and a metaphor is a type of analogy. Analogies aren't necessarily metaphors. Analogies are direct comparisons, whereas a metaphor suggests that one thing is like another. If you say, hey, that car is a real piece of beep, you're not being literal there. You're being, it's a metaphor. If you're talking about the computer industry versus the airline industry, well, computer industry, airline industry, they're both industries. You're suggesting a direct connection if you're talking about analogy. But the big takeaway for metaphor, analogy is mainly AP Lang, so get that out of your head. Metaphor is making the unfamiliar familiar to the reader. The girls were tigers on the playing field. Well, what's that tell the reader? They were fierce. They were animals out there. Juliet is the sun. She's bright. She's the center of this guy's world, which is somewhat important because in Shakespeare's time, the prevailing belief was that the earth was the center of the universe. But what we started to figure out in Shakespeare's time is that it was actually the sun that was the center of everything. And this is Shakespeare kind of referencing that idea because about the time that Shakespeare was writing his plays, Galileo was, oh, where's that? Oh, look at that. Look at that. We revolve around the sun. So Shakespeare there is riffing on that idea. All right, a motif. We didn't talk about motif at all. Motif relates to theme in a way. It is also a technique. It's a reoccurring pattern in a literary work. All right, so the appearance over and over of a particular symbol, subject, theme, or idea. Blood in Macbeth is a motif. Blood, 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 blood. Another motif is in The Great Gatsby, which I'm rereading. Thank you very much, Emma Hazenberg, for putting that back in my head. Green comes up a lot. And green is associated with, well, jealousy. All right. Motifs are used to suggest things to the reader. Now, in a passage that you have 45 minutes to analyze, a motif isn't really something you need to concern yourself with because you've got a section of a work and you really don't have the time to find that. Although you might. Something might be repeated several times within a passage and become a motif. I mean, if it works for you there, great. But as with anything, I suggest in these videos, your mileage may vary. I told you to not worry too much about structure. I told you to not worry about too much about motif. But those things might be pretty prominent, and you might have a lot of luck with them. Onomatopoeia. Again, this is a technique, and this is more about poetry. We're not really going to concern ourselves with that too much here. Although you could certainly see it in stories. Bang, buzz, crackle, sizzle, hiss, murmur, and roar. So these things might be employed by a writer to suggest an environment, setting, and mood. The use of onomatopoeia, the writer's employment of onomatopoeia, whatever, creates the setting. You might write about it that way, but it's mainly a poetry thing. Oxymoron is a type of irony. It's a technique. Paradox is a technique. Paradox is a situation in which competing ideas are both true. So foul and Faraday I have not seen. So here's an interesting paradox. The world is pretty much stopped as I make this video for you, and and the paradox of it is we have more time on our hands, a lot of us, than we've ever had, yet there's very little we can actually do right now. Both ideas are true. It's ironic, tragic, and it's a paradox. All right, personification, we've talked about. It's a technique. Pun, a play on words. Writing with a broken pencil is pointless. Ha ha, ha 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 ha, ha ha. This is a technique. Repetition is a technique. Repetition of a motif is a technique. And it's all about emphasis or effect. Rhetorical question. Again, rhetorical question is mainly a Lang thing, but it sometimes comes up. A writer may put a rhetorical question in a character's mouth. The character that stands up and asks, "Isn't it time that we took action?" What kind of character would employ that rhetorical question? Putting that rhetorical question into that character's mouth creates that character. Oh, this is a reflective character. This is a thoughtful character. And we got there because the writer chose to put a rhetorical question in the mouth of the character. Satire is absolutely a technique. Humor, irony, or wit to make a point or to show what is wrong with society. When it comes to satire, it's comedy. Comedy reveals a truth. Remember that. All right. And here's the lovely example. At this rate, we might as well dump garbage straight into the ocean if we're not going to increase the penalty for polluting the environment. That's also hyperbole. All right, simile, metaphor. A simile is a type of metaphor. So teachers like to use that as a gotcha question. Don't worry about that. It's a comparison using like or as. Her eyes gleamed like stars. The house was as large as a castle. To turn it into it's a style choice. Her eyes gleamed like stars, as opposed to her eyes were stars. That's a metaphor. It changes the tone of it a bit. Her eyes gleamed like stars. Oh, that's more lovely and flowing and poetic and reflective. Her eyes were stars. That's more direct. That's that's more immediate. The house was as large as a castle. The house was a castle. Puts you right there. Bam. And then symbol. So that's a technique. That's a technique. Symbolism and simile. All right, so simile is different than symbolism. The symbolism, it stands for something else larger than itself. A rose can symbolize love or beauty. Flag symbolizes the country. Darkness symbolizes evil. And symbols become motifs. Motifs become themes. All right, sentence starters. How to write about this junk. All right, we got a weak verb right off. But if you've got 45 minutes, shows, man, go to the well. Go to the well. You've got 45 minutes. The author uses dialogue as a method of characterization to show. But you can very easily rewrite that as the author's dialogue characterizes. You can turn this into a verb. This is a weak verb. But it works. It works. It works. I mean, we all should have a surgical mask, the N95 mask. That's effective. That's more effective. But if you tie a simple bandana around your head, it'll work. But it's definitely weaker than a surgical mask. All right, the narrator's use of depressing diction. So you could just get rid of that. The narrator's depressing diction helps to express a tone of sorrow. Doesn't that sound better? But if you want to if you want at this point, use and show. Use and show work. They work. They work. They work. You have 45 minutes. They work. However, it's very easy to not use them. It's the narrator's depressing diction helps to so much better. So much better. And you can even make it simpler. The narrator's depressing diction expresses a tone of sorrow. Words such as blank and blank help the author too. All right. First person point of view helps the reader to understand how the main character reacts to. The author uses flashback in this scene to show. The author's flashback shows. So demonstrates, reveals. Demonstrates and reveals are stronger words, but there it is. The writer's use of imagery conveys a sense of the examples of repetition and alliteration in the poem help to emphasize, but this is question 1, and we're not too concerned with that. All right, so the point here, this is the point, this is the thesis of the whole thing. The point here is to show why an author uses various elements and techniques and to examine how he or she uses them to help create meaning. So meaning is theme. What the heck did it all mean? The author's purpose should always be your focus, and it is your job to explain how the elements and techniques contribute to that purpose. And that purpose is to, for a writer of literature, is to explain ourselves to ourselves. And that explanation centers around being born, living, or dying. What aspect of humanity is the writer? What aspect of humanity is the writer exploring? All right, so we've reached the end. Oh my God, how long have I been? 39 minutes. My God, I've been going on. This was supposed to be a quick video. Like and subscribe. Like and subscribe. Get notifications when I drop fresh content. I hope you found this video useful. This document is available on Canvas. I highly recommend it. I highly recommend downloading it and having a copy of it next to you while you do your exam. This is just such a great document. and I'll probably also be going over it in our weekly Zoom meeting as well. But this is a nice tool. It's a really nice tool, and I hope you get something out of it. As always, I hope you're well and safe and doing what you're supposed to be doing. And it's not about grades anymore. This is about, do you want to learn about this, and do you want to learn about it from me? And if the answer to both questions is yes, here I am. If the answer to both questions is no, or maybe so, maybe later, hey, I'm cool with that. I know that you're going to do what you feel you need to do right now, and I trust and honor what that choice is. Well, until next time, cheers.